So, good afternoon. Let's slowly get started. Yes, somebody asked me about. Yeah, I didn't put up a homework last week simply because last week I was completely overwhelmed with teaching the undergrads, so I didn't find time to finish what I wanted to show you. But maybe we just do what I wanted to do tomorrow in the exercises together. Essentially, my idea was to look a bit more at the PCA and try around a bit to see how well does this reconstruction work if we actually have some PCA data and we project it into. If we have some data and project it onto some subspace in order to do a PCA, how much information do we lose? And what you will find is that the information you lose is simply the sum of the squares of the eigenvalues that you didn't use. So if you use the first five, principal components, then you will find that if you sum up the squares of all eigenvalues and compare it with the squares of the first five eigenvalues, then this is the part which you keep and the other part which you lose. And I wanted to make a little R exercise where you can actually see that. In the two obvious ways, two obvious data sets we should do this is of some single cell data set where we can see how well these cells, where we can see how well the cells are described. If instead of all the genes, we only use the 50 or so principal components, and where specifically we then can go back to one of our highly variable genes and ask if I try to reconstruct the expression of this one gene from our principal components by undoing the projection or rotating back from the PCA space into the original feature space, how well can I then still see the expression of this gene? And that's quite instructive to see that this works reasonably well, but that it's terribly distorted by how strong by all these effects of very low counts, where we have 0 or 1 count, that completely puts the PCA off, and we will later see that we can go around this by replacing our PCA by a different one, which essentially works with an autoencoder. Has anybody ever worked with autoencoder? I had them. Who has already worked with neural networks? Okay, and that's right, be a good neural networks are trendy, and I guess it's something we all have to get used to. So we will then try to get around this using neural networks. I'll explain in a moment, or in more details later, what this is about, but now for us to sort of get back into where we stopped, I wanted to start with this here. Display. I've already found the outcome PGA again. Do you have a pen? Can I have your pen? Like, part on the source. That's the auto setup. So, what I've done here, and I think I've shown you this before already, but now we can look at these different things. I want to run my standard analysis of single cell data, or simple analysis, not using Seurat, but only using inbuilt R function. So when you really see what's going on, I restart my R, so when I start with the display, and load the matrix package and the sparse matrix stuff. And now the first thing I simply load is here. This time I use data from this project together with Martin Vinalba group, where we had these stem cells which go from neural stem cells which become neuroblasts. And I read in this data matrix. Should be there in a second. Maybe 3. No. The term blast means usually an immature cell. An immature cell, a cell which hasn't fully differentiated into its final state and might still proliferate a bit. That's what biologists call a blast. And of course, cancer cells are always blasts, but there's also normal blasts which are supposed to be blasts. So, this is this matrix which if you remember, which is this sparse matrix format, which tells you in row 1, column 31, there's a tube, and in the very first line it tells you how many rows and columns the matrix has and how many non-zero entries. So once I have this, I can simply build a sparse matrix from them by giving it as I and j, the indices I and j, and the value by vector x, and the dimensions which I read off here. And in R, if you write -1, it means all elements except from that is row number 1. So that way I now get my count matrix as a big matrix. And we also had this row labels and column labels. Here the row labels, and I just take only the barcode column from that and put this here. And here is the gene labels. I delete the MM thing because I don't need it anymore. And the last collection myself. Now I calculate the fraction. Again, I calculate the column sums, the total number of reads I have for each cell, and calculate and turn this into fractions. And this is what we did, I think, in the second lecture. We choose the highly variable genes from this plot, where this is the row means of a fraction divided by the row bars divided by the row means. And here is the expected crossovers. But now I do my log transform. So I logarithm it with this log1p function, which is zero preserving, after multiplying it by 1 before, so that this logarithm actually has an effect. And now we do the PCA. And here you see how I do the PCA. I use my expression matrix, which is now the log transformed data, and I subset it to only the 2000 most variable genes, correct ones. And I have to transpose it because we want to go from, maybe we should put names for this. If we have the genes in the rows, and if the genes are the rows and the columns are the cells, we call this the bioinformaticians form. If it is the other way around, we call it the statisticians form. Because statisticians have the habit of making one row for each object which they analyze, and the columns for different things they find out about the objects. And bioinformaticians like to do it vice versa. So we have today here, we have our matrix in bioinformaticians format, we switch to statisticians format with this transpose. We tell the PCA that we only need the 20 subsets to compose. Because now we run into a point which we haven't looked at before when we talked about PCA yesterday. Last week we actually just took the full eigensystem with all eigenvectors and eigenvalues. We completely diagonalized the matrix. And we can do this, but our matrix is pretty big. It now has what was it, 18,000 columns. And even if the subset took only 2,000 genes, then still, once we make this, you remember for the PCA, we do this y to y, so the correlation of each gene with every other gene, which means with a 2,000 by 2,000 matrix, and then might take a while to get all the 2,000 eigenvalues and eigenvectors. And this means work away because we only want the first 20 or so. So we need something called the truncated eigenvalue method, which is able to give us only the top eigenvalues and do this fast. I use here something from the Irrelevant method. Irrelevant stands for iterated reweighted Langkos bidiagonalization algorithm. And a package. So, and I thought I make here a short break and explain how the Langkos algorithm works. Before, let's look what this PCA package has spit out. And you see it has spit out our rotation matrix, which is made up out of the eigenvectors, and our score matrix, which is the projection. And just to keep the eigenvalues, I notice that, of course, the row names here, they are the gene names, and the column names and the row names of the other thing are the cells. So putting that back in makes it easier to us to notice here in the rotation matrix, each gene is described by its loadings to the 20 principal components, and here in the X matrix, each cell is described by its 20 coordinates in the phase space or in the subspace. Specifically in the basis of that subspace formed by these. And what we also have, because this time we ask the matrix to automatically scale and to automatically center and scale the matrix. So before going through it, it has subtracted from each gene the average expression value of this gene, and then divided the row for this gene by the corresponding by its standard deviation. So afterwards, all the genes, so all the rows, or now the columns, depending which way around you go here, have mean 0 and standard deviation 1. So, what does this Langkos bidiagonalization algorithm do? You know, the normal algorithm for calculating eigendecomposition, you know how it's done on paper and pencil. You find the characteristic polynomial and then you solve it. Now, of course, if this is 20 degree, you have to use some numerical technique, maybe Newton's algorithm to solve it, and then you try to find your eigenvectors. There's a whole bunch of more clever algorithms which are used in numerics, the QR algorithm and a couple of others, but all of them try to work with the whole vector. And then there's a completely different class of truncated PCA algorithms which work which only return the top 10 or top 20. So you give it a number, how many eigenvectors you want, and it only returns those, where top 10 means here 10 is the highest eigenvalue or the highest eigenvalue of absolute value. These algorithms were terribly complicated. It all starts with a simple idea which is called the power method. And from the power method, we go to the Langkos method, and from the Langkos method to the Irrelevant method. And each time there comes another clue into it. But I quickly show you how the power method works, because that's certainly the easiest thing and gives you the flavor of the whole thing. Imagine for a moment you have some matrix A, which is symmetric, so it can be diagonalized. And you want to find its eigenvectors. If you want to find its first eigenvalue. Now let's assume that the eigenvalues are lambda 1, lambda 2, lambda n. Now I assume that they are sort of ordered by magnitude, and here this is an ordering by magnitude. So this is the one which is largest in magnitude, and the corresponding eigenvectors I call u1, u2, and un. And when I now have some random vector x, and I just pick a completely random vector, and if I knew the eigenbasis already, I could expand this vector in the eigenbasis by making L, what do I call it, alpha L u L. This would be the vector x expanded in the unknown eigenbasis. And if I do this, then I can write what is A to the x. It is ul pushed through A gives, of course, lambda L ul, because after all it's an eigenvector. And rho L stands here, and we have to add this up over all of them. And if I go through the matrix again, then this thing, everything stays the same, but I get another lambda L. So if I go take the kth power of A, then the kth power is this thing here with lambda L ul. And now, if I divide out of this, the first, okay. And now you can imagine how this works. Yeah. This is the alpha, right? So, as you can see, every time the lambdas get a power, and the power of lambda I1 grows fastest. So after a while, you are only left with this part. And to write this down properly, I first started writing it down on a piece of paper to copy it on the board. But then I got lazy. I show you now this sort of lazy lecturer's method. Ask ChatGPT to make their notes, because this time here it actually works really easy. I simply asked ChatGPT to see here, given a matrix A with eigenvectors u1 to un and eigenvalues lambda 1 to lambda n, show that A to the m over it tends to u1. So that's what we want. We have here our matrix A, and start with a random vector v, and we always normalize this so that it has length in norm 1, and we say this would converge against u as m goes for infinity. How do we do this? We assume A is diagonal, so we can write it as u lambda u minus. We also assume that the top eigenvector lambda 1 is the largest in magnitude. It's larger than all the others. If it's negative, then of course you have to just put in a minus, but it still works. And with this, now it's rather easy. I write my initial vector, as I've just started here, as decomposed in the eigenvectors. And now, if I want to look at the nth power, then what I get is, of course, my coefficient, the mth power of lambda I and the ui. So, this is what I've written on the board. Now I got lazy and didn't want to do this, because what I now do is I factor out the lambda 1. And if I put lambda 1 to the front, then of course here I'm just staying with alpha 1 u1, and here this thing gets lambda I over lambda 1 with I equals 2. So you see we split this thing here, we split out the top term, and the other term now have all this, and they have all here something in parentheses which is smaller than 1. And because it's smaller than 1, of course it goes to 0 as m goes to infinity, right? This thing stays as it is. Of course, to put it properly, we have to normalize this thing. So if I normalize this thing, then I now take the norm of that. All these parts here are orthogonal, so I can look at them separately. I pull the lambda 1 out. If I pull the lambda m out, keep this one. And in the end, all this extra stuff here vanishes. This here is normal anyway. And so we get what we wanted. we normalize m power of a, if we apply a m times to some random vector v, no matter what vector it is, in the end we get something which is just the eigenvector u1. ChatGPT was clever enough to put the plus minus, which I had forgotten. So you see here how this works. In the end, intuitively, it's quite clear. Always the component of a vector which I put in that goes in the direction of the dominant eigenvector gets stretched the most, and all the other directions get stretched less. So the vector moves closer and closer to where we started. And so this would be my two eigenvectors, and this one is the dominant eigenvector, which is longer, and I start with this vector. Then maybe this component is elongated a little bit, and this component gets elongated a lot more, and then I'm already further in, and so this thing goes to the dominant eigenvector. So this means if you have a random matrix and you only want to get the first eigenvector, you don't even need to diagonalize anything. You just keep applying this thing to a random vector, and unless your random vector you start with happen to have zero component along the eigenvector, which would be bad, you get the first eigenvector. Once you have that, you can of course get the second eigenvector by starting again with a random eigenvector, putting it through the matrix, subtracting the part which projects on the first eigenvector that you've already found, redoing that over and over, and then you're left. You must end up with the second largest eigenvector, because the first largest eigenvector you always subtract that part. Now the whole thing has a catch. It doesn't work if I was to implement this in a computer. Because always projecting and subtracting stuff and so on suffers from rounding errors, and these numerical instabilities add up, and in the end your vector, your dominant eigenvector, you don't get it exactly, but it might be slightly off. Then if you, for the next step, you project on this dominant eigenvector, you don't subtract the correct part, but still keep a little part left in your vector, which goes into the dominant eigenvector, and then of course that thing will blow up again. So that's the catch of the thing. It doesn't really work as I've just described it, that you subtract always the component going into the dominant eigenvector, because you don't get the exact eigenvectors, you're off by a few rounding errors, which means that the vector which you are left with after you subtracted the component going in the direction of the top eigenvector still contains a little bit of that, and due to this eigenvalue being largest, this little bit will blow up again, and so you don't probably get rid of it. This, of course, meant for the numericists, this meant that the idea in principle should work, but you need a lot of extra stuff. Lankosh had this idea, I think, in the 40s, and then came some Russian mathematician called Krylov, who had one good idea, namely he said, if I want to make sure that I don't fall into this trap that I've just said, I should always keep some subspace in which my vector should be, and I keep projecting into the subspace. And the crucial idea of subspaces here is you start with your random vector B, and then you take this matrix 1, second, and so on, apply to it. And of course, again, this thing should converge to our eigenvector, and it should make a span which goes to all these eigenvectors, but that span is a bit annoying because all these vectors are, because that's what we want, are nearly collinear. What you can now do is to use Gram-Schmidt orthogonalization to make it non-collinear, to make all these vectors orthogonal, and then you keep having a basis for what you want to project in or what you want to project out. I don't want to go further into this depth. I only want to tell you that there is a lot of stuff into it. So the next thing which then comes in this diagonalization, the next stop in this whole thing is that people realize that to do this properly, you can use this Lankosh method, right? We were starting with power method when we looked at this Krylov subspaces. Now comes Lankosh, who had the idea that we can use they had an idea which allows you to make a three-diagonal matrix, where you have elements not only in the diagonal, but also one to the side of the diagonal. And that thing, and now there's another bunch of good algorithms which give you eigenvectors once you have to make the matrix tri-diagonal. So you have two steps. First, you make a big matrix into tridiagonal matrix, and then you make the tri-diagonal matrix an ordinary diagonal. And people looked a lot into this. This again had numerical instability, and I think it took 30 years of research to come up with a system that actually works, and that was this IRBA algorithm, which made, of course, a huge stir, because this problem of diagonalizing large matrices appears all the time, especially in engineering. If you do something like finite element methods, imagine you have a big building and you make a wireframe model of this building, and now you want to know what will be the harmonic swinging motions of these buildings in order to see whether it can withstand, say, an earthquake. You need to find the harmonics, like where to bump the building, with which speed it will go. And for this, if you want to do this, you would back up a wireframe model of it, where you basically approximate the building by a lot of point masses which are spread along a lattice, and then you can calculate the inertial tensor of this thing, and to find the eigenfrequencies and the eigenmodes of how this building might swing, you have to diagonalize this matrix, and that's what you can do with this IRBA algorithm. So this means there's a huge practical reason why people need this. Luckily, they all solved it by now in the 1980s, so now we can simply use it. I'm honest with you, I've read all these pages a couple of times and still not sure if I really understood how the IRBA algorithm works. I think I'm starting to understand how Langfors works, but why Langfors isn't numerically stable and how the IRBA thing solves this, I don't know. Luckily for us, this is sort of solved by other people. But I always like to put it because I think all this work by the numerical researchers of the 70s and 80s is something we now use every day without ever noticing. So let's point this out. Yeah, this was this seminal paper which solved this whole matrix diagonalization issue. This is actually already a newest one, which is now even more stable and faster and whatever. I think the first one, which really worked recently, was somehow from the 80s. So, what was the next thing I wanted to show you? I want to do a clustering. I want to, you remember in the end, we had this graph, which we'll come to in a moment, which, let's just jump ahead. This already. In method, this now plot. Oh, this is not what I want. I quickly in just 1 second. You remember last time we had this, we said once we have this data, now here you can see this data, and you see this time it's sort of a bit more interesting, the structures along it, but in the end we now want to do clustering so that we color all cells which are close to each other in the same color. And for this we now need to talk about clustering algorithms. And there's a couple of them, and I want to mention all of them and then explain one a bit more in detail. So first, with word clustering, in a way it has two slightly different meanings depending, or three slightly different meanings depending on whether you talk with physicists, you talk with data scientists, or whether you talk with machine learning people. Let's start with a physicist, because I'm a physicist. Imagine we have points which all sit like here. when you might say, okay, there seems to be some background process which puts points everywhere, and there seems to be a couple of hotspots here, here, and here, where you get many points. So in that sense, a cluster is simply an area where we have many points which are close to each other, or many cells which are similar. Whenever you have some big feature space and you have a group of objects in this feature space, or vectors, or whatever you want to call them, which is close to each other. Note that there's a couple of other points which sit outside these clusters. They are not assigned to any cluster. Another way is, but many of the algorithms that we'll talk about, they don't like outliers. They basically assign every cell, every point to one cluster. And maybe the most famous and simplest one is called k-means. And that is such a nice Wikipedia page with a nice animation that I should simply show you. So, let's make this picture. What this does here in the end, as you can see, we have all these data points which are now in a two-dimensional setting, and it assigns each point to one of three colors. And the algorithm is very easy. We start with 3 randomly picked points on this thing. Not data points, but we just pick 3 random points on this two-dimensional space, or in our data space. Sorry, forgot to say. We first have to decide on how many clusters we want to do. So here in this picture, they decided they want 3 clusters. So this is K. It's the 3 mean clustering. So it means I pick 3 random points, and what I then do is that I assign each, and the 3 points I associate with the 3 colors. They call it the 3 means. And now I associate each point with the closest mean, with the closest one of these 3 points. And then once I've done this, I have now assigned each cell to each point to one of the 3 clusters. And now I calculate a new mean, which is now the actual centroid of all the cells which we have. So you see here these crosses here, which with little black crosses, these are the means, and they are always calculated as the mean. So the centroid, which means the x-coordinate is the mean of all x-coordinates of one color, the y-coordinate the mean of all y-coordinates of one color. And in this case, I always iterate between 2 steps. One step where I calculate the mean of all the points which are currently assigned to my cluster, and the other step is assign each point to the closest center. And the funny thing about k-means is even if you start off with completely wrong things, it always will more or less converge to the same final assignment. Can get stuck in local minima, but it rarely does. But one thing which it doesn't, so this here is, machine learning people have a couple of standard data sets which they always like to use to demonstrate this. This here is called the Mickey Mouse data set. You're supposed to imagine, notice that there is a big face and 2 mouse ears. And ideally we want to have a clustering algorithm to say, well, this is one cluster, this is the second, this is the third cluster. But k-means, because we always assigns to the first and the closest one, of course comes up with these boundaries. This is why one of the second things which you might do here is how's it called? Gaussian mixed cluster. We try to say, okay, we again assume that there are 3 clusters, and we try to create 3 multivariate Gaussians which sit on this thing here. And this one is the EM algorithm. I think that's also something where we here have beautiful animations, if I remember right. Another one. Here we go. Exactly. So this is another famous data set. This is called the Old Faithful data set. It's one of the standard things in R. I think if you type geyser, when you get this, who knows Old Faithful? If you don't know it, you've obviously never been in Yellowstone National Park. This is Old Faithful. It's a geyser in Yellowstone National Park in the northwest US. And it has this funny thing that every hour or so it erupts and produces this big fountain. And some geologist was wondering how this thing works, and did here and calculated and just stood there with a stopwatch for a couple of days and measured, and always measured for each eruption. He measured the duration, how long did the eruption last in minutes, 2 to 6 minutes, and how long did he have to wait since the previous eruption. And he found this thing here, and as you can see, you can fit 2 Gaussian models, so the red and the yellow one. In the end you have 2 Gaussians, and you know how a multivariate Gaussian works. You have to specify a mean, and then you have to specify a covariance matrix, and the covariance matrix gives you both gives you how wide this thing is in x and y direction and how it is curved. Technically, the covariance matrix works the way that if you look at the eigenvectors of the covariance matrix, they're exactly the half-axis of these ellipses that we now have. And the eigenvalues are the sizes in the different directions. Now you see, once we have managed to find a way to fit the 2 Gaussians to it, this works quite nicely, and fitting 2 Gaussians in that case means if xi is the probability that we get a point x from this thing here is given by the probability of this x under a normal distribution with some mu sigma. So you know the normal distribution for multivariate normal is our usual x, what you have also in the normal distribution, then you subtract the mean to shift it to 0, and normally in the normal distribution then you have in the exponent of the exponential, you have in the numerator, you have the distance of the data point from the mean squared, and don't ask too much about the normalizing term exactly. I think there's something missing. I also can't remember whether we ended under that root or not. I guess you can look it up. But the point which I want to say is in the normal distribution, you have in the numerator, you have here x minus mu squared, so just the distance to the center squared. And in the denominator, you have 2 sigma. So the 2 sigma squared, where sigma is the width of the string. And what we now do here, we write this for the exponential shape, for the multivariate case. I could do the same, that I write this as e to the x minus mu squared over 2 sigma squared. But if I do this, then my thing will be isotropic, as you say. same shape in all directions. If I now want to do something like this, then I have to say, okay, the sigma for this direction will be different than the sigma for that direction. So that I do something like x1 over 1 over sigma 1 squared and x2 1 over sigma 2 squared, where I can write this as x1, x2, sigma 1, sigma 2, x1, 1 over sigma 1, 1 over sigma 2 squared, and so you see how this works. My x minus mu squared over 2 sigma squared, I now wrote in that way, that I get a matrix, a quadratic form where I multiply the vector from both sides, and then x1 gets multiplied by this thing, and x2 gets multiplied by that thing, so that x1 squared gets divided by another factor when x2 squared gets divided. And in that way I can make the multivariate normal which is more spread out in x1 direction than in x2 direction. And if I now want this whole thing to not be axis parallel, but that the axis of my ellipsoid are rotated against the axis of the main part, I just have to rotate this matrix here. I could imagine putting a rotating matrix in here, and then I get a new matrix. And of course, if I had only the new matrix which sits here, and I want to know what is this thing actually doing, I have to diagonalize it, and then I can put it. And this is what this thing here does. It tries to find entries, values for the mean coordinates, and entries for the sigma matrix in order to find something which fits like that. And in the end, it has, and every time it calculates what's the probability for all the data points getting this. So for the usual, you call this maximizing likelihood. We insert the coordinates of all our data points in this probability and multiply all the probability to get the overall probability that this distribution with this mu and this sigma produces the data points that we have here. Now obviously if I multiply so many data points that doesn't work well, so in practice one takes the logarithm of this thing and adds the logarithm and says we want to find those values for mu and sigma and alpha that maximize this log likelihood. So the sum of the logs of this thing I put in different values of x. And to maximize the likelihood, and here the thing which you see at the end is the final fit. And as you see from the final fit, it clearly shows that we can say that this data matrix belongs to two different clusters, a red cluster and a yellow cluster. You can also say what is what. And the geologist who made this thing then concluded from that below this eta there must be two big cavities, a smaller and a larger cavity, and when either of the two is full, it erupts. And if the smaller one is full, it takes it faster for it to fill up, but it makes less, but although the eruption is shorter. And if you wait long enough, then maybe the large one has filled up and the duration will be longer. But that has not switched between the two. Yeah? Somehow there isn't, but I forgot the reason. I think there was some, they speculated that there might be some mechanism below which shuts some valves, something moves back and forth and either output one or the other. But yeah, I've forgotten how this works. But this is sort of a standard demonstration of the so-called expectation maximization algorithm, which also, I don't want to focus on it now because I'm clear, I'll focus on something else. I got carried away by this thing. It actually is that you always do two steps. You first ask what's the probability of my data point coming from either of the two distributions, and then you calculate for each distribution its mean and its precision matrix by using a weighted average over all the data points which were assigned to this cluster, weighted by the probability that we have assigned to this cluster. And you flip back and forth between these two processes and try to get a better and better likelihood. You can show that this converges. So, this all out, but the nice thing is that Wikipedia really has a lot of nice things. Here they have an overview of clustering algorithms and the different kinds of clustering that we have. What we've now just talked about is k-means here, which is a typical case of an algorithm which is based on centroids, and there's a couple of other things, but here they have already shown you the typical example where you can't work with k-means, and you also won't be able to do this with Gaussian clustering, because this thing sort of encircles the other cluster. And that's something which we will see often in our single cell data, and hence we need something which finds that this is one cluster and this is another cluster, and where you usually use linkages, which means you ask how similar are these clusters. How similar are the data points? What's the distance between the data points? And then you use this to find a clustering. And I show you two linkage algorithms. So maybe to put it that way, the k-means clustering and the density, what's it called, EM clustering, they both relied on the fact that for both of them, you have to give the complete data matrix to the algorithm. For everything which we talk about now, you can simply use only the distances. So you, from your data matrix, you come to a distance matrix. So a square matrix, which tells you where is row I, column J, tells you what's the distance from cell I to cell J in feature space. And if you have this, one of the most popular one is called hierarchical clustering, and I quickly show how this works. Let's imagine these are our points, and then the system first asks, what are the two closest points, and connects them. And then we now say the rule that this thing will now count as one point. And if we want to ask what is the distance of this thing or of that thing to this combined object, then we have to use a linkage rule. We might say we always take the distance to the smallest. So this thing has that distance to the combined thing, and that point has this distance to the combined point. So whenever we ask what's the distance of a point to a combined group of points, we take the distance to the smallest of them. Or we might say we take the average of the distance to all the things which are in there. But what we then do later, but once we have done that, we now ask next which clusters are now closest, and we might find these are now closest. And then I might find actually the next closest is this thing to those here. And then next it might be these two, then maybe these here, this thing to this aggregate, then this thing to that aggregate, then perhaps this here, then finally perhaps that thing, and last now this aggregate to that aggregate. And if you look closely, you notice that I've drawn a binary tree. Here is somehow the tree root, and if I go out, at each junction I get two things out. So this is called hierarchical clustering. or agglomerative clustering, because we always we start with all the points out, and when we choose the two closest, they connect them. When we take again the two closest objects, and we always find some definition of closest as by defining the distance, not only from point to point, but also from subtree to subtree. This is very popular in biology because it reminds them. It reminds people also of philological trees, so you know, evolutionary trees, which tell you what comes from what. But it has one disadvantage. You need a density matrix. You need to know initially the density of each point to every other point. And if we do this with our 20,000 cells, which we have at the moment, that's a matrix with 400 million entries. Calculating this thing is already will take a while, but then whenever we want to do this a step in this clustering, we have to find the minimum in this big matrix. Then we have to recalculate the matrix to update the part which is now for the agglomeration, and that's why in practice, once you have more than 500 points, agglomerative hierarchical clustering becomes too slow, because it scales quadratically with this thing, or maybe even cubically, I'm not sure. But it's a simple and easy thing which is distance-based, but it doesn't work here. We have too many cells for it. So when people started with single cell, they had all these things in mind because they were the popular one, and wondered what do we try next if this doesn't work. And then they came up with and when they looked at an unexpected area, namely graph theory. Graph theory, you all know, is the part of mathematics where our objects are graphs. That means we have a set of edges, we have a set of vertices, and we have a set of edges, and the edges connect always one vertex with another one. And graph theory is everything you can do with this. One science discipline that got a surprising interest in graph theory in the 2000s are sociologists, because they wanted to understand how people form groups of friends or subgroups within a society. And around 2000 there emerged an amazing data set to study this, namely the Facebook friendship graph. Facebook, which after all was the first big social network, as you remember, it has this logic that everybody can friend somebody else, and then the other person is asked whether it wants to accept this friendship, and if so, the two become friends. This means, if we now consider every Facebook user as a vertex, and whenever two Facebook users are friends, we draw an edge between the two. When we have a big graph, it's a symmetric graph, because if A is a friend of B, then B is also a friend of A. It's an undirected graph. We don't make any difference. We don't store who's initiated the friendship and who accepted it. We just have this thing. And now we can try to find communities in that. Let's say our friendship graph looks like this. Then we might say, okay, these are two groups of friends. This is friend group A and this is friend group B. And they don't really know each other except for these two guys who happen to be acquaintances. So if we now want to split this graph into two communities, then the best idea would be to split here and assign all these points to one community and all those points to the other community. And generally, we will now use, in graph theory, we use the term clustering as a partitioning of the vertices. So we set up a number of clusters or communities or groups, it's always, all these terms mean the same, such that the set of all edges is partitioned in these different groups. So two groups are always no interaction, and they all add up to the full thing. Yeah. No, the vertices. So we have a graph with a vertex set and with vertices and edges as usual, and we say we have some groups. G is already my graph. Let's use C for cluster. We have some CS, which are all subsets of C, such that the union of all of them is V, and we have C and CS and CT is 0 or S, not T. So their union is the whole vertex set. They are disjunct in that sense. It's a partitioning of a set of vertices. And now we want to, we can come up, of course, with arbitrarily many partitioning, well, not arbitrarily, but due to the number, well, you can calculate yourself, some combinatorial assignment of, if we don't fix the number of clusters beforehand, we can come up with a large amount of clusterings, and some might be better than the others. For example, assigning this, and this to group A, and this, and this to group B wouldn't make much sense. So we want to define a score which tells us how well a suggested clustering reflects the internal connectedness of the graph. And an obvious suggestion for this score would say the fewer edges cross a cluster boundary, the better. And so our score might be that we look at all the edges and ask which fraction of all the edges crosses, connects two clusters. And this fraction should be as low as possible. This thing that I've just described has one disadvantage. It has a trivial maximizer. I could simply say I only make one cluster and put everything in this one cluster, then none of the edges connect two clusters. So that's the optimal cluster. So I need to penalize for that. And the graph theoretical people came up with something they called the modularity score, which does this, which it modifies this idea that I just had, in a sense that we get a meaningful maximizer. And I've prepared a little R file to demonstrate this to you. CC modularity, here we go. Here, dash restart R. If you want to read it, I think I've put it on the web page, but so far only for the M. So, this here, which one? This is your modularity, yes. Okay. I'll make it a bit bigger. So I load the data that we've just looked at. Ah, damn it, I've forgotten something that I need to show you before. I need to show you how to make our nearest neighbor graph. So we have our, we have to find, we have, if we take our PCA, and then X is the PCA coordinates for every cell. We now can calculate the distance from every cell to every other cell. And we make this huge distance matrix, of which I've just said it's too big to do practical work with. And then what I can do, of course, is if I ignore the fact that it's too big, I can just make this big distance matrix and then go through each row and find the 20 smallest values and write out the column indices of these 20 smallest values and say these are the 20 closest neighbors, the 20 nearest neighbors of the cell to which this column index belongs. And if I do that, no, actually I don't, this takes too long now. Session, please terminate R. If you do that, here is the code that I've written for that. And as you can see, I go from row to row through this big distance matrix, sort them, and get the indices of the first 20. And then I get this NN thing, which then looks like this here. Yeah, this, you can read it as follows. It means cell number 1's closest neighbor is cell number 2697, the second closest is 3349, and so on. And the 20 nearest neighbor of cell number 1 is that one, and for cell number 2 it looks like this, nearest, second nearest, and so on. So this is how you read this neighborhood matrix, which is a matrix with 1 row for each cell and 20 columns for the 20 nearest neighbors, and it contains cell numbers. So column numbers in our count matrix. To make this, as I've just said, the stupid way to make it is to calculate the big distance matrix and check everything against everything, and that takes ages. But you can get a result, so for this thing it takes about a minute. But if I do the same with a clever algorithm, like here, where's actually the search box? Right here. Like the functional nearest neighbor algorithm. Paul's nearest neighbor? That's not the one that I mean here. Doppelpunkt get KNN. We use this fast nearest neighbor package, and the fast nearest neighbor package uses a KD tree. And let me show you more how a KD tree looks like. It's a way of organizing a big data set so that you quickly find it. I don't want to go through the buttons, but here you can see again a nice animation. It shows how nearest neighbor search works in the KD tree. So they assume here that it's a two-dimensional thing, and the way how this thing works is that in every iteration of the tree, the space is split by a hyperplane into two halves, and the tree tells you which ones are in the left half and which ones are in the right half. Now I should have looked at this before, but if I remember right, the idea behind the KD tree algorithm is that at the beginning you decide at random on D unit vectors, which go in random directions, and each of them, you say, defines a hyperplane, and hence splits the whole feature space in two halves. And then you make a tree where the first tree you split into which data points are in the left half of the first hyperplane and which are on the other side of the first hyperplane. When you do on each side, you do this with respect to the second plane, and so on. And this is easy to do because you know once you have a vector which describes a hyperplane, and you have a data point, you want to know which side is the data point of this vector. And you take the vector to the data point, you take the scalar product of this with this, and if it's positive, it's on one side, if it's negative, it's on the other side. And so you can make a big binary tree where you always go left, on the div level if the scalar product with the div thing is negative, otherwise it's positive. And that now allows you to organize your data very quickly. And if you now look for the neighbors of a given point, you can find easy algorithms to figure out where you actually have to search for neighbors. So that you don't have to go through the whole list to find the nearest neighbors, but only those which are in quadrants which are nearby. See if this system here does anything clever. We draw this here, we put our data points on it. I guess that the color means the third coordinate. And yes, and now before we want to find a neighbor for a red point, we check with respect to the two hyperplanes here. In that case, we keep checking back and forth. We because it's only two-dimensional. And when we get to this tree, and if we then want to find more of them, we have to go one step back in order to look also in the neighboring ones. And in that manner, I have a good chance that I find all my neighbors before I'm in the smaller, before I have to go all the tree back up again. And the crucial point is that if I sit at a certain point and I look at a certain subtree of my big tree, I can say what is the smallest distance that a data point can have which is not in my subtree but somewhere else. And this allows you to always make sure whether it's at all necessary to look at the other subtrees. And using this, you immediately get loads of, you can very quickly find all the points which are close to a given point after you have placed your data in such a binary tree. So, but here I simply use the FNN algorithm. You see here, I simply called here FNN, gave it my PCA coordinate and 20, and then it produced me this matrix here that I've just shown you. This one. And now what do we do with this matrix? So what I now, the other thing is in here, I've already pre-calculated a UMAP. And now here is the UMAP again. We've already seen that one. Yeah. And NN is the nearest neighbor matrix. Also already seen that one. And now the first thing I want to go to a graph. So I turn this neighborhood matrix in this neighborhood table into an adjacency matrix, where I make an edge whenever two cells are among each other's 20 nearest neighbors. Or more precisely, as soon as one cell considers another cell as one of its 20 nearest neighbors, I draw an edge. To do this, I have to make an edge list. So I take here the first column, these are all the nearest neighbors, and I can say there's an edge from 1 to 2697, from 2 to 10169, from 3 to here. So if I put the numbers from 1 to n in this first column next to each other, I get an edge table where I always say edge from here to here, here to here, and so on. If I then take again the numbers from 1 to n and take the second column here, I get another list of edges. And if I hence put all these columns below each other into one long vector, then I get all the places where the edges should go to, and as the starting point of the edges, I take the other half. So I show you how this looks like. I take this, take this here and say, this is all the starting points of the vectors. Repeat the value 1 to the number of cells 20 times, because we have 20 neighbors. And this is where the edges start, and this is here where the edges end, namely in all the values which are in these columns successively. And I use this now to make an adjacency matrix. So a big matrix, an n by n matrix, where I can look up whether two cells are neighbors or not. If they're neighbors, there's a 1. If they're not neighbors, there's a 0. And of course, I use sparse matrices because most are not 0. And I use the triplet format for sparse neighbors, so that if I do this, I get now my adjacency matrix. And if I look into this adjacency matrix, then I see the x-axis is where the edges all start. The column indices is where the edges end. And the x always tells you the edge is weight 1 because it's always the same weight. Now, of course, as I said, it's a symmetric graph, so whether I go from cell 1 to cell 2 or backward shouldn't matter. But this matrix is not symmetric because I've collected each cell with its 20 nearest neighbors. And so now I want to make it symmetric by adding its transpose. And once I do that, I will notice that now some of the x values have become 2. Oh, none here, but later. This can happen if, for example, you have these cells here, and let's say all these cells, we only take the 2 nearest neighbors. So this cell says, these are my 2 nearest neighbors. This cell says these ones. and this cell says these ones. But then comes the loaner cell over there and says, these two are mine, even though they don't consider me a neighbor. And hence all these edges are now appear twice in our list, and these edges only once. That's why some of the edge weights have now doubled to 2. And to get rid of this, I just say, wherever I say 2, put it back to 1 with this edge minimum here. So, if I look at the column sums of this adjacency matrix, I get the vertex degree. Remember, the degree of a vertex is the number of edges that are incident on a vertex. And so if I just add up a row or column in this adjacency matrix, I get all vertices in there. And if I look at the histogram, I can already see every cell has at least what has happened now. Now something went wrong, because obviously every cell should have at least 20 neighbors, but some of the cells due to this effect have more than 20. This cell here has more neighbors than this cell. The most popular cells have 100 neighbors, probably because they sit in the very minimum of the cluster. Now, there is a very widely used package for graph theoretic calculations called iGraph, and iGraph has some internal way of storing vectors, and I can do this by just telling it, take my adjacency matrix that I've just made and turn it into an undirected graph. And then I get here an undirected graph of edges from here to here and so on. And I can ask iGraph, do this Leiden clustering, which optimizes the clusters. And it calculates here a score, 0.847, and I want to explain to you now in the next 10 minutes what this score means. So what I do now here is I plot this thing. Here, if I plot the UMAP and color each cell by its neighborhood number that it got here, this is a value between 1 and 21, and I get here 21 different colored patches. And what it does is optimizes this modularity score, and to do this, we will now have a look at the clustering that the algorithm has produced in order to try to reverse engineer what it has done. What I now will do is first I get an edge table back of all the edges in my graph. I got this time for my adjacency matrix, and I made sure that I only took the upper diagonal half of my adjacency matrix so that I don't double count edges by simply saying I only want it listed as from the lower number to a higher number. And now, once I have this, and of course for each of the values here, I can look up the membership in this clustering membership thing. And then it tells us here, this edge goes from cluster 1 to 1, this from 2 to 2, and so on. And that makes it very easy to see how many edges break the cluster bar. They simply have to see how often are these two numbers not the same. I ask how often is the starting cluster and the ending cluster of the edge not the same, and I come to see these are 28,000. I can also ask the opposite questions, and I replace the sum with the mean when it divides by the total number of things, because you know it considers this Boolean thing as zeros and ones. So if I take the mean of it, it just gives me the fraction of ones among all of them. And with that, I learn that 92.2% of all the edges stay within the cluster, and only 8% break cluster boundaries. And now I want to call this value J. And as I've already told you, if we take this as our value to maximize, it would be easy. We just say there's one cluster, and then this value will be 1. The idea that we've forgotten who came up with this, but some graph theory or graph practice person had now an idea how to do this. They said, let's compare this with the maximum modularity score which we can get under edge permutation. An edge permutation means we break all edges into two halves by cutting them in the middle, and then we reconnect them randomly. So for terminology, we will now call this here a stub and say each edge has now been broken into two stubs. And the degree of a vertex tells us how many stubs originate from it. And in order to now get an edge permutation, we pick 2 random stubs and connect them. And then we pick 2 other random stubs and connect them. And we keep doing this until we have everything connected. And we ask what might be the modularity score in that one. So notice that after the edge permutation, we get a new graph where each vertex still has the same degree as before, and each vertex still is assigned to the same cluster, but it has new neighbors. The crucial point about the edge permutation is that it gives us a new graph where every vertex keeps its degree, and only what changes is the connections. It's a bit a funny idea that instead of permuting which vertex is assigned to which color, they permute where the edges run, but that has its points, because this allows us that the number of edges which originate from each cluster stays the same in all the permutations. So I can try this out. I take my edge table, this before, and you see here, this table starts with 2, 9, 6, 7. And if I just want to make an edge permutation, I have to change the connection. I have to find for each vertex in the left side a new partner on the right side. And this I can simply do by shuffling the 2 columns. So I make some random permutation of this color of the second column. I could also permute the first column, doesn't really matter. So I make this permutation. In R, the function sample permutes a vector. And you see now we get each time different values here. So just to make clear that what sample does, if I give it the numbers from 1 to 10 in order, every time I get a different permutation. So, and now of course I can recalculate again which clusters are now connected, and now we see this vertex is now no longer connected with cluster within a cluster, but breaks the cluster. And I can calculate how often which percentage of these value pairs are the same and which percentage are different by using here the mean function. And I come to the conclusion only 7.5% of all the edges stay within a cluster. And we can compare this with the 92% that we have with the actual one. And this is the thing which we now maximize, the difference with these 2. And so one issue is here, I calculated this thing here by random permutation. So every time I rerun this, you get a slightly different value. That's annoying, and also it makes our calculation slow. So I want to find an analytical way to calculate it. And to do this, I do the following. First, I calculate for each of my 21 clusters how many stubs there are in it. So in that case, for example, if this here is my clustering, then this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and well, you see how many stubs. As I said, to get the stubs, I simply have to add up the degrees of all the vertices in the cluster. That's what I do here. Take the vector which tells us for each cell with how many other vertices this vertex is connected. Take this vector which tells us to which group each of them is, and then for each group in here, take out the corresponding values from these here and apply this function sum. That's what tapply does. To do this, then I get here the degree sums, which tells us for each vector how many vertices come out. I will call this DC, degree sum for cluster C. And of course, if I add all these things up, then I should get the total number of edges. Degree sum. And this is twice the total number of edges, because remember, we are counting stubs, not edges. So each stub exists twice. Each stub is counted twice. So if I now look here at the number of rows of my where I have put my adjacency list here of my edge table. and multiply this by 2, I get exactly the same number. So now I can call these, and now I can go on and say how many of, I can now ask what is the expectation for J0, for the random number of edges. And that now is quite easy. I can say the probability that I can ask how many, I want to connect two vertices. And the number of possible connections is, of course, let's see if I have this. No. CO25, have I already put this up? This CO20 single cell omics are here. Because then you don't have to look at my large dollars here. Here is what I said. I can, of course, let's say D is the sum of all these here. And now I can say if I want to make an edge, I pick a random stub and pick another random stub. And then I get all the possible number of edges that I can put. And of course, I have to divide by 1/2. Otherwise, I double count each edge. And, sorry, and this should read D times D minus 1/2. And if I only want to make a connection within a vertex, then I have to say the number of connections I can do within cluster 1 is 44,000 squared over 2, and that is 33,000 squared over 2. So overall, we can see that the number of clusters of edges that I can make which stay within an edge is, this is the sum of these things. And I can write this in a nicely symmetric form by saying the numerator is the sum of the squares of all these degrees, and the denominator is the square of the sum of them. What I've done here, of course, I canceled the 2 from the top and the bottom, and I forgot these minus ones because all these values are 10,000s or so it doesn't really care. So we now say this is J0 here, this thing. Now, how do we calculate J? For that, we've already calculated J further up and said the total fraction of inner things is 0.925, and J0, if we now calculate this thing here, sum of the degrees squared divided by square of the sum of the degrees, we get 0.07. And if I subtract the two numbers, I get this, which is exactly the same as that our Leiden algorithm produced us. Now, we have 5 minutes left for this last part, and that was the part where I got stuck. So we talk about this tomorrow, next time, or I'll try to make a homework out of it. Because what we can now do is, imagine I make a big matrix which tells us how many edges go from cluster C to cluster C prime. So I get this big matrix, a big matrix of 21 by 21 matrix, where I can always read up how many edges go from cluster C to another cluster. And in the diagonal, of course, I see the edges which stay within a cluster. Using only this matrix should be enough to calculate M, the modularity score. Because if you do that, with this matrix, you can read off the diagonal everything that we need for J0, and you can read from the rest of the terms. You can directly just check the sum of the diagonal compared to the sum of a whole matrix should give you J. And if you subtract the two from each other, then you should get the modularity score. I think I just made a mistake in what I've just said, and I have to remove the lower matrix, otherwise I double count the things again. That's why it didn't work when I tried it this morning. But you can imagine, maybe it's a nice homework. If you want to do a little bit of combinatorial puzzling, try to find out, given this 21 by 21 matrix, where simply you write for all the edges, how often do you see a connection from cluster C to cluster C prime, can you calculate M, the modularity score? And will you get the same thing as what iGraph gives you. Now, why is this important? This is a funny little thing, because imagine you would change now something. You pick one vertex and decide this vertex should no longer be in cluster 3, but I move it to cluster 5. And you want to know how the modularity score changes. This is now easy to calculate, because if you move the vertex from cluster 3 to cluster 5, then you just have to look at this vertex and ask, where are this vertice's neighbors? And for all these for all the edges which go off from the vertex V, you have to subtract 1 in the corresponding elements of this 21 by 21 matrix, and you have to add 1 for all the new ones, which is of course because the vertex is now somewhere else. So if a vertex has 20, this means that it's very quick to calculate how the modularity score M changes if you just change the cluster assignment of a single vertex. And this gives us now what's called the Louvain algorithm. The Louvain algorithm means in order to optimize the modularity score, I start off by assigning each cell to its own cluster. Each vertex gets its own cluster. And then I pick one after, go through all the vertices in order, pick the vertex and try to insert it into each of the other clusters and check whether this increases or decreases the modularity score. And this can be checked by just a few simple addition and subtractions. You don't even have to, importantly, you don't even have to keep the matrix updated. It's sufficient if you keep the numerator and the denominator updated. So in the numerator, you remember you have the number of within edge clusters, in the denominator the number of all clusters. If you now move a vertex from one cluster to another, then you just have to check how many edges now change from within to between. And accordingly, you have to increase or decrease the numerator by the corresponding number of edges. And the effect of this is that you can, that it's very quickly to take each vertex and ask, would the modularity score increase if I put this vertex in any of the other clusters? You go through all the clusters, pick the one which increases the modularity score most, and if all of them decrease it, you leave the vertex in its cluster where it is at the moment. And then you jump over to the next cluster, to the next vertex, redo this, and you can imagine at the beginning each vertex is in its own cluster, but after a few rounds, each vertex will have been put together with many other vertices. And in the end, the number of clusters gets smaller and smaller because more and more vertices end up together in the same cluster, until at some point, you cannot move a single vertex without decreasing the modularity score, and then you finish and say, this is now my clustering. While I was talking about it, I realized that we don't have to, because what we really have for our modularity score is, our modularity score is number inner edges divided over number of edges minus J naught. J naught is the expected number. I calculate it once at the beginning, the way I've put it here. And this thing, this number of total edges also stays the same, only this number changes. And I just have to check, okay, I take my vertex, I ask how many of this vertice's edges are within a cluster. Let's subtract this from this, then put the vertex to its new cluster and ask how many edges are now within the cluster. And you add this. And then you immediately have this number updated. And you just have to ask whether this number goes up and down. Wait, yes, sorry, the J naught also has to be updated because the number of inner vertices, because if I change a vertex thing when the starting cluster will lose one and the ending cluster will gain numbers here by the degree. So this, the right-hand side, the J naught, which is sum over C dC squared over sum over C dC squared. Here in this thing, up here, one term of the sum will lose as much as the degree of this vertex is, and the other term will gain that. And if I calculate the two squares, then, yeah.
How many times do you have to iterate over all vertices?
Good question. I wonder if this thing tells us that. Probably quite a couple of times, because in the end we are starting with 20,000 clusters. In the end we have 12 clusters. So given that each, can this be? Actually, let's try this out. I'll check. But my guess would be a few hundred times. That it's quick. But then there's another catch. This is a classical example of what the computer scientists call a greedy algorithm. It just goes through all the locally possible moves right now and picks the one which currently involves it best, even though this might steer the whole thing into dead end. But the nice thing about greedy algorithms is they are fast because they don't have to think ahead. And if they work reasonably well, maybe you can use them. And here in this case, this algorithm works good enough to get a very good modularity score and a clustering which seems to be good. You cannot get the optimal clustering, that's NP hard, probably. Such things are always NP hard. But this thing works quite well, except for one thing that the people in Louvain noticed. So you might have noticed this is all somewhere in the northwest. Louvain is Leuven, and there's these two universities, Leiden and Leuven, which I think are only 50 kilometers apart, and the Leuven people found an improvement to the algorithm of the Leiden people, because they realized once the Leiden algorithm finished and says, now none of my moves further increases the thing, what you can now do is make a new graph where each of the clusters now becomes a single vertex, and the edges between the clusters is the number of the thin cluster edges. And then you run the Leiden algorithm on that one, and that's possibly the Leiden algorithm can then say, okay, I can merge these two clusters to a bigger cluster, and that increases the modularity score. The reason why the first Leiden algorithm wouldn't find that, because if it needs to merge two clusters, it could be that it can only always move one vertex, and it would have to subsequently move one to the other, and each of these individual first decreases and then increases modularity scores. But once you allow the Leiden algorithm, now that you're finished, you can just take each cluster as a whole and ask, does it further increase the score if I merge these two clusters? Then it finds usually as a better clustering. And you iterate this outer loop as well. Once that one finished, you again say, okay, let's run this once more. Yeah. No, you don't, because of that term here. It becomes one as well, because if you have one cluster here, then, and this is a crucial point, this one counterbalances. And now you can do a bit of math by wondering if you move a vertex of degree D from cluster C to cluster C prime, how does this changes? And of course you have to subtract D from one of them and add it to the other, and then you get something like DC minus D plus DC prime, that's the new vertex, plus D, both squared. When the DC squared vanishes, I guess, what do you then get? And you get DC squared plus DC prime squared. This is what you had before. Minus 2D DC minus DC prime plus e squared. I hope I put this correct. So in that way you can say this was the value of the numerator here before, and when you move the cluster, the vertex from cluster C to cluster C prime, when this goes down, this goes up. So you can adjust this numerator by just adding this thing, which probably now has some calculation mistake, but you see the idea. And in the same way here, I simply have to count, and this is why I need the other matrix that I said before, where we write for each, where we keep track for each cluster how many edges are in. We need that? No, we don't need that. We just have to calculate how many edges change status from being inner edges to outer edges when we move a vertex. Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm misunderstanding the point of the algorithm. The first line on the right whiteboard. So that's the left one is your updated count for within edges for cluster C, and the right summand is the same thing but for cluster C prime, right? Isn't this isn't.
But that's this side here, the J naught side, the expectation side. You have to make another update on this side.
Okay.
And they sort of counterbalance. And then you have to check whether we update here, then you have to calculate whether the whole expression changes. So this one has this update, and this one here has the update of check how many edges change from Jane's inner status. And that's the beauty that all of this is just simple additions and subtractions, or maybe a multiplication, so you can calculate this really fast. And this is why this modularity score algorithm is able to find communities in this giant Facebook graph with hundreds of millions of users, while all the other clustering algorithms have long broken down there. The catch is things like this here, where we have a point which is actually an outsider and which now gets added to its nearest cluster, and even though it might not really belong there. And that's something that we see often, right? There's a couple of cells which are somehow don't fit anywhere, but the Leiden algorithm puts everything into some clusters, and you don't even notice afterwards, because we forget about the distance. We only keep the neighborhood graph. And if we then look at the distance, we might notice that in some clusters, the typical distance from one cell to its nearest neighbor is 1, and in the other cluster it's 10. So different clusters can have very different densities. And depending on how you look at this, it's a good thing or it's a bad thing. It's a good thing because if you have different cell types with different variation, one cell type where all the cells do exactly the same, and so they are all really close, and another cell type where the cells vary a lot, one cell does this, one cell does that, and so on, you want a clustering algorithm which sort of looks a bit further in one and a bit closer here, and that's the beauty of a neighborhood view. But the catch is once a cell has a mixture of neighbors. Some neighbors are really close and some are way further out and are sort of outliers in the distance map score. When things get weird. So I think I've talked enough for today. Let's meet tomorrow for those who want and try a bit with PCA and so on, and maybe we can also play with this a bit. We'll probably keep it a bit shorter. And I'll try to come up with a little homework tomorrow or on Wednesday. I'll probably put it online where you can play a bit with PCA and play a bit with this thing. What was the last thing? Yes, for the PCA, I wanted to do something that you can try to get your own Big Five score and find out your personality. I got myself somehow in some, I tried and made some mistake and it didn't work. Maybe I find the time to try again, or otherwise you can also try if you want to. Okay, then see you tomorrow next week.